The rain hammered against the windows, the sound echoing in the quiet room. I stood there, frozen, my hand gripping the doorframe as if it were the only thing holding me up. My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. I hadn't planned for any of this. It all began so innocently. He wasn't just my nephew, he was the one person who always seemed to understand me, even when no one else could. Kind, patient, and steady in a way that made me feel safe. And yet, something had shifted. Slowly, over time, without me even noticing until it was too late. I couldn't explain the way my chest tightened whenever he spoke to me, or why his smile lingered in my thoughts long after he'd left the room. It was wrong, wasn't it? To feel this way? But what happens when the lines between right and wrong blur? When the world outside fades, and all that's left is a moment that feels too important to let go. I stood there, caught in the storm both outside and within me, as he turned to face me, his expression unreadable. And in that instant, I knew there was no going back. Have you ever felt like you were standing on the edge of something you couldn't name, something that terrified you as much as it pulled you in? This is my story. A story of love, loss, and the choices that haunt us. My name is Grace, and I've always been the one people could count on. The dependable one, the person who held the family together when things got tough. That's what I was to Michael too. Michael is my sister's son, my nephew. From the moment he was born, I felt a special connection to him. I was there for his first steps, his first scraped knee, and every milestone in between. He grew up to be the kind of young man you'd be proud of, respectful, kind, and thoughtful. He was always helping out around the house, always making sure I was okay. He called me Auntie G, and every time he said it, it brought a smile to my face. He wasn't just family, he was my friend, my confidant. When I went through a tough divorce 2 years ago, Michael was there. He'd sit with me for hours, just listening. Sometimes he'd bring me tea and remind me to eat. But somewhere along the way, something changed. At first, I didn't notice it. It was little things, how his hugs lingered just a second longer than they used to, how his eyes would meet mine and hold there for a moment too long. I told myself it was nothing. He was just being caring, just being Michael. Then there were the conversations. They became deeper, more personal. He'd ask about my dreams, my regrets, and my fears. He had a way of listening that made me feel seen, truly seen, in a way no one else had before. One evening, we sat on the porch, the sun setting behind the trees. The air was warm, and the world felt quiet. Michael turned to me, his voice soft. Auntie G, do you ever feel like you're meant for more? Like life is passing you by, and you're just watching? I looked at him, surprised. Of course. I think everyone feels that way sometimes. He nodded, but there was sadness in his eyes. I feel it too. But with you, I don't feel so alone.
I didn't know what to say.
His words stirred something in me, something I couldn't quite name. Then came the night everything changed. It was a stormy evening, the kind where the wind howled, and the rain came down in sheets. Michael had come over to help fix a leaky pipe in the kitchen. We spent hours working together, laughing and talking like we always did. When the job was done, we sat down to rest. I made us hot cocoa, and we settled on the couch. The storm raged outside, but inside, it was warm and quiet. At some point, I must have said something that upset him, because his face grew serious. Auntie G, he said, his voice almost a whisper. You don't have to keep pretending you're okay all the time. It's okay to let someone take care of you for once. I felt a lump in my throat. Michael, I'm fine.
Really?
He reached out and placed his hand over mine. You don't have to be. I don't know what came over me, but in that moment, something shifted. His hand felt warm, steady, and I didn't pull away. Instead, I looked into his eyes, and for the first time, I saw him differently. The space between us seemed to disappear. I felt his arms around me in a comforting hug, the kind he'd given me 100 times before. But this time it was different. It wasn't just comforting, it was electric. I pulled back slightly, my heart pounding. Michael, we can't. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. Why not? I didn't have an answer. The storm outside felt like it was moving through me, stirring up emotions I had buried for so long. And in that moment, the lines blurred. The storm outside was relentless, but inside, the world had come to a standstill. Michael's eyes locked on mine, and for a moment, it felt like the only sound in the room was my own heartbeat. He was still holding my hand, his thumb gently tracing small circles against my skin. It was such a simple gesture, but it sent shivers through me. I wanted to pull away, to break the moment before it grew into something neither of us could undo. But I didn't. Grace, he said softly, dropping the usual Auntie G that had always felt so familiar. Hearing him say my name like that, like it was something precious, made my breath catch. Michael, we can't do this, I whispered, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I believed them. Why not? He asked again, his voice steady, but filled with a kind of longing that I couldn't ignore. You're the one person who truly sees me, who understands me. Why should that be wrong? I didn't have an answer. My mind was screaming at me to stop this, to remind him, and myself, that there were boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. But my heart was betraying me. His touch lingered longer than it should have, and I felt my resolve slipping. The warmth of his presence was intoxicating, and the way he looked at me, like I was the only thing that mattered in the world, made it impossible to think clearly. I stood abruptly, breaking the moment. Michael, I need a minute, I said, my voice trembling. I walked to the window and stared out at the rain. The drops streaked down the glass, blurring the world outside. My reflection stared back at me, eyes wide and filled with confusion. This is wrong, I said, more to myself than to him. This isn't how things are supposed to be. Behind me, I heard him stand. His footsteps were soft, almost hesitant, as he came closer. Grace, he said again, his voice like a melody that seemed to fill the room. Tell me you don't feel it too. Tell me this is just in my head, and I'll stop. I turned to face him, and the look in his eyes nearly broke me. He wasn't the confident, steady Michael I'd always known. In that moment, he was vulnerable, his emotions laid bare for me to see. I don't know what I feel, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. All I know is that this is tearing me apart. He stepped closer, and I felt the heat of him before he even touched me. You don't have to be afraid, he said. I would never hurt you. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I shook my head. This is wrong, isn't it? We shouldn't feel this way. It's not right. Michael's hands found mine, his grip firm but gentle. What's right and wrong isn't always so clear, he said. Sometimes, the heart knows things the mind can't understand. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the whirlwind of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. His words made sense, but they didn't make this any easier. Have you ever been caught between what you want and what you know is right? I asked, my voice breaking. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he let go of my hands and stepped back, giving me space. Every day, he said finally. Every time I look at you, the room felt too small, the air too heavy. I wanted to run, to escape the weight of what was happening, but my feet wouldn't move. I need time, I said, my voice trembling. Michael nodded, his expression softening. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. As he turned to leave, I felt an ache in my chest that I couldn't explain. I wanted him to stay, but I also needed him to go. I needed to figure out what was happening, what I was feeling, and what it all meant. When the door closed behind him, I sank to the floor, the sound of the rain outside blending with the quiet sobs I couldn't hold back. Have you ever felt like your heart was pulling you in one direction while your mind screamed for you to go the other way? That's where I was, caught in a storm I didn't know how to escape. The days after that storm were a blur. Michael kept his distance, giving me the time I had asked for, but his absence only made me realize how much he had become a part of my life. Every quiet moment, every passing thought, seemed to circle back to him. I told myself it was just confusion, a fleeting emotion brought on by the storm and the circumstances. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Then one night, everything changed. It was late, and the house was quiet. I had just finished cleaning up the kitchen when there was a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. It was too late for visitors. When I opened the door, there he was. Michael stood on the porch, the soft glow of the porch light illuminating his face. He looked tired, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Michael, it's late," I said, my voice unsure. "I know," he replied, his voice steady but soft. But I couldn't stay away anymore. I stepped aside, letting him in. He walked past me, his shoulders tense, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He stopped in the middle of the living room and turned to face me. "Grace, I need to say this. And I need you to hear me out." I nodded, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "I've tried to stay away," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I've tried to pretend that what I feel isn't real, that it's something I can ignore. But I can't. I can't stop thinking about you." "Michael, please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No, let me finish," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "I know this is complicated. I know there are a million reasons why this shouldn't happen. But I also know that what I feel for you isn't something I can just walk away from." I stood there, frozen, his words washing over me. Every part of me wanted to tell him to stop, to remind him of the boundaries we couldn't cross. But another part of me, the part one had been trying to ignore, was screaming for me to listen. "I don't know when it started," he continued, his voice breaking. "Maybe it was when you opened up to me after your divorce, or maybe it was the way you always seemed to understand me without me having to say a word. All I know is that you're the one person who makes me feel like I'm enough." Tears filled my eyes, and I looked away, unable to face the raw emotion in his gaze. "Michael, this isn't fair. To you, to me, to anyone. What you're feeling, it's not right." "Then why do I feel this way?" he asked, stepping closer. "And why do I think you feel it too?" His words cut through me, leaving me breathless. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong. But I couldn't. "Michael, this is wrong," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is it?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. "Or is it just different from what the world expects?" He reached out, his hand hovering near mine, waiting for me to decide. "Tell me to leave, Grace, and I will. But if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, then let me stay. Just for tonight. Let's figure this out together." The room felt impossibly small, the air heavy with unspoken words and unanswered questions. His presence was overwhelming, his words wrapping around me like a spell. I wanted to pull away, to put distance between us, but my heart betrayed me. It begged me to stay, to take a step closer instead of a step back. "Michael, I started," my voice faltering. He closed the gap between us, his hand gently brushing against mine. The touch was so small, so simple, but it felt like the world had stopped. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice breaking. "You mean too much to me." Tears streamed down my face as I looked up at him. "I don't want to lose you either," I admitted, my voice trembling. And in that moment, all the doubts, all the fears, seemed to fade away. It wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about us, two people caught in a storm they couldn't control, holding on to each other because it was the only thing that made sense. The world outside seemed to disappear, leaving just the two of us standing there, facing the truth we could no longer deny. The room was still, the silence almost deafening. My heart felt like it was caught between relief and terror. Michael stood close, his eyes searching mine, as if he could read every thought swirling in my mind. I don't know how long we stayed there, neither of us moving nor speaking. It felt like time had stopped, the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on us. Eventually, I found my voice. "Michael, what happens now?" I asked, my words barely more than a whisper. His expression softened, and he reached out to tuck a stray piece of hair behind my ear. "We figure out," he said simply. Together. Morning came far too quickly. The light streaming through the windows was harsh, chasing away the safety of the night. The weight of our choices settled heavily between us. I sat at the kitchen table, staring into my coffee, while Michael stood by the window, watching the world wake up. Neither of us spoke for a long time, the silence filled with unspoken questions and uncertain answers. "Are you okay?" he asked finally, his voice breaking the quiet. I looked up at him, his face a mixture of worry and something deeper, something I didn't know how to name. "I don't know," I admitted. "Everything feels different now." "It doesn't have to," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "We're still us. We'll always be us." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to hold on to the hope in his words, but the reality of what we were facing was impossible to ignore. "What if this changes everything?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What if we can't go back to the way things were?" He crossed the room and knelt in front of me, taking my hands in his. "Then we move forward," he said. "We don't have to have all the answers right now. We just have to take it one step at a time." I nodded, the lump in my throat making it hard to speak. As the hours passed, Michael stayed by my side, his presence a steady comfort. But eventually he had to leave. Standing by the door, he hesitated, his hand resting on the doorknob. "I don't want to go," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine. "I don't want you to go either," I replied, my heart aching. He stepped closer, pulling me into a hug that felt both comforting and heartbreaking. "This isn't the end," he whispered. "You know that, right?" I nodded, the tears I had been holding back finally spilling over. "I know." As he walked away, the house felt unbearably quiet. I sat on the couch, staring at the door he had just closed behind him, my mind racing with everything that had happened. Was this the right choice? Could we really navigate the storm we had created? Deep down, I knew our story was far from over. There were too many unanswered questions, too many emotions left unexplored. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, I realized something else. I didn't want it to be over. For better or worse, Michael and I were connected in a way I couldn't explain. And no matter what the future held, I knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. What happens when love defies all boundaries? You uncover not just the depth of your feelings, but the strength it takes to face them. And sometimes, that's just the start of the journey. As I sat there, alone in the quiet house, my mind still swirling with everything that had happened, I couldn't help but wonder about you, the one listening to this story. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have stayed or walked away? Could you have ignored the pull of your heart? Or would you have given in to the connection that was impossible to deny? I really want to know what you think. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me if you think I made the right choice, or if you would have done things differently. I'm so curious to hear what's going through your mind. If you're enjoying this journey as much as I am, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit that bell so you can stay updated on all the twists and turns of this story. There's so much more to come, and you won't want to miss it. And if you're craving more heart-stopping romance and stories that pull you into a world of forbidden love, check out my playlist. Trust me, there's so much more waiting for you. Stories that will make you question your heart and your choices. I can't wait to share the next chapter with you. Until then, take care and remember, some stories aren't just about love. They're about discovering who you really are.